Morning, everybody. How we doing today? Today is a Monday morning. I made an episode yesterday, which I decided to take down. It was about some real civil unrest that happened in North Carolina back in 1898, which I thought was an important story. But I also prefaced that by talking about how I lost my DJ gig. Someone overheard something I said, took it out of context, and I got canceled essentially. And I was always raised, and I've always believed that we're judged by our actions, not our words. And that's kind of an old adage: judge a man by his actions, not his words. So many people say the right thing but don't do the right thing. But today's sensitive culture, I just felt better taking it down and not having my channel canceled too. So that being said, I lost my job, and I might get it back potentially, but it's not a very great chance. We'll see how things go. But if you ever had thought about supporting this channel and helping us out with Patreon or buying some merchandise, now would be a great time to do so, because I have no income and there's no backup safety net for me with the pandemic anymore. And so jobs like that are hard for me to find. They're pretty tough to come by. So we're hoping that cooler heads prevail, because obviously there was no intent for me to be offensive, but someone was offended, and that's the world we live in today. So the North Carolina thing, which happened in Wilmington, North Carolina, is pretty shocking. In 1898, a bunch of white supremacists overthrow the Republican government, which was actually a coalition government, a fusionist government, which had a lot of black people in that Congress, and even the city mayor. There was a lot of African Americans, because they were a majority of the population in Wilmington, North Carolina in the late 1800s. The Republican Party during Reconstruction was on the left side at that time. The Democrats were on the right. They were making progress. They had a lot of businesses and financial institutions. The blacks had made a lot of progress in Wilmington and were creeping into the political infrastructure of the state and the city, and it led to the whites uprising and basically completing a coup d'etat, voter intimidation. They pretty much, through violence and fear, skewed the elections of 1898, and then the few positions that were left that weren't up for that election cycle, they basically made those people resign at gunpoint, and they forced a lot of black leaders out of town at gunpoint on the train. Armed guards guarded them out of the state lines. Then a riot ensues. They go and burn down the black newspaper in town to silence that voice, and a lot of the blacks run into the swamps and are freezing and starving, and an armed white militia congregates of 2,000 people, and they start marching around, just destroying black property, black neighborhoods. They say 60 to 300 blacks were killed in this awful event. It really turns your stomach to hear about it. And the outcome, they overthrew a democratically elected government. So much for the power of democracy, and that shows you what freedom really doesn't define. Things aren't what we think they are. And now we see in this recent cycle of elections how race and fear and riots are being used in that same way. And now they're trying to do the same kind of voter intimidation and changing the results of the minority vote, trying to minimize the impact that they have. It's a lot of fear mongering, and a lot of it's control that the elite are afraid to let go of. And so they have to get their white-based populace uproared in order to tilt the scales back in their favor. If you haven't heard about 1898 in Wilmington, North Carolina, you should read about it. I saw a documentary about it, and it's enough to really curdle your blood. Some of the things they talked about, filling the rivers with black bodies and just shooting them in the streets unprovoked. You know, it was an ugly, ugly chapter of American history. And when you look at the map that I've seen of all the injustice, massacres against blacks during Reconstruction and through civil rights. It's enough to make you tear up. You know, some of these stories are just so atrocious, and to even hear the Christian conservatives, some of the things they say, it's the Jesus I read about wouldn't find much favor in what you're saying or how you're behaving. I'll tell you that right now. But if you don't know nothing about that massacre and the riots and like they marched around, it's just scary. I can't imagine how terrifying it must be. And as a human, I've always tried to feel empathy for other people who struggled. I've been through some tough times, and it's always drawn me to the black experience and the art that they've made, because I know there's a sorrow and a pain that's informing that. But I digress. I want to move on. Today I want to do something a little interesting, that I hope it's interesting. I want to talk to you about two records I feel really sound like the 50s, two records that really sound like the 60s, and two records that really capture the 70s in jazz. And I think they're kind of hard for people to hear when they don't have the chronology laid out for them like my collection kind of has. And so I'm going to show you two things that are really prototypical 50s to start off. And first I want to start with this great Buddy Collette record. And Buddy Collette was a brother from the West Coast. And he's playing here with Howard Roberts, Frank Rosolino, Red Mitchell, Bill Douglas, Red Callender, Bill Richmond. A lot of great West Coast talent right there. This is on the Specialty label, which is a little label that has a couple great titles. You know, I showed you that Al Gray, Lee Morgan record the other day. Dizzy Atmosphere, a lot of guys from Dizzy's band at the time. That's a great Specialty record. And there's not a lot of titles that I know of, and I think a lot of it wasn't jazz. But there's about 4 or 5 titles I know that are really solid. I just found this one recently. Great cover, showing Paris of that era. And it's just great playing. And you hear some very interesting sounds. The 50s, as we move into them, we're moving away from the bebop of the 40s. And bebop's really just opened up Pandora's box to say that anything can be done. Doesn't mean it's always done well or that it always remains jazz. But jazz starts to fuse itself to a lot of different things. And composition is behind a lot of that. We kind of move away more from the blues and more from the American songbook and find ourselves creating more pastoral sounds, more eclectic sounds, more dynamic sounds, more avant-garde sounds. That's already starting to stir. Pithecanthropus erectus is 56. Some of that Jimmy Joffrey stuff on Capitol is 54, 55. Some of that stuff's very dissonant. It has a lot of interesting, I love Howard Roberts. But this is a great example of the diversity of the sounds of jazz in the 50s. And if I had to pick, I'm a 50s guy. I love the sound of the 50s. There's some tuba here by Red Callender that's outstanding. Creates a nice low end and a thick, gooey, but viscous sound. Just fantastic stuff. Collette plays the alto and the tenor, clarinet and the flute. Of course, Rosolino's the great trombone player. Howard Roberts on the guitar, Red Mitchell on the bass, and Bill Richmond and Bill Douglas take turns on the drums, it looks like. But again, it's a record I haven't seen much. And if I have, I didn't recognize it at the time. That's the thing always, is like, did I see this record a lot before I knew what it was? I mean, I just passed it, or I didn't know who Buddy Collette was at that time, or what Specialty Records was. I wish I had the knowledge I had now when I was digging through record collections and shelves and stores back in the 90s, when everyone was getting rid of their vinyl. And I still did pretty good. I came up pretty good during the 90s, collected a lot of great stuff. But remembering how cheap that stuff was and how much of it was available, and how pawn shops had just racks of this stuff before the different stores and Japanese came over and started buying up all this random vinyl, because the Japanese saw what was going to happen, you know, and they bought pallets of stuff. And that same holds true across the country from everything I've read and been told. And this is mostly coming from record store owners. I've shopped around the country, and all the guys who've been in this business for a long time remember in the 90s how the Japanese would come over and buy vinyl by the pallet load. Just anything and everything. And they targeted jazz, of course, but they also wanted Queen. They also wanted T-Rex. They also wanted, it seems like almost anything they were willing to grab up and buy it in bulk. And I'm sure their shipping costs had to be pretty high, shipping pallets of vinyl back to Japan. But I was saying, I wish I had that kind of introspection I had now, looking through these places back in the day, warehouses of used vinyl. And of course, my knowledge was limited to my experience at that point, which is true for all of us in life. Again, here's another kind of different sound. When we're in the bebop era, a lot of bebop tends to sound set quite similar, or has quite similar tempos most of the time. They might slow down and do a blues somewhere, but it's usually kind of up tempo. It lacks these melodic headers that kind of state melody and give us a framework. The 50s brought that back. And this is not hard bop. That's more limited to that black East Coast aggressive sound. Not to say that these white cats on the West Coast weren't capable of some incredibly aggressive up-tempo music, but there's always a grift, a context that lightens that pace and makes it less chewy. It just has less tension wrapped up in it. So when you hear sounds like this with tubas and flutes and just a wider range of sounds, but done in a smaller group context, and it's not these big group ensembles like the swing era where entire sections of trumpets and trombones were doing things. It's almost more back to the Dixieland era where you have a trumpet doing this, a clarinet doing that, a flute doing this, and everyone's kind of going their own directions at times. The 50s is such a disparate sound, and it's really hard to define it really in any kind of a narrow context. So once again, we hear a theme being stated, and this is a great Kenny Clarke at the Cafe Bohemia with an incredible lineup of guys. This is the black side of the 50s in a nutshell. These are one of the early seeds of hard bop. There's hard bop happening. Miles Coltrane's kind of that first quintet is doing it. Clifford Brown Max Roach Quintet was really the first, I feel, to really nail that sound, that up-tempo, but still with melodic and pulsing rhythms. And it's not as anonymous and as just like bebop just feels to go wherever it feels to go. And hard bop has more of a channeling of that focused aggression. And on this fantastic record, we still have some of the same principles at play from the Buddy Collette record, but we have Nat Adderley on the cornet, Kenny Clarke, of course, on drums, Kluk, Horace Silver's on the piano, Cannonball Adderley's on the alto, Donald Byrd's on the trumpet, Paul Chambers on the bass, and Jerome Richardson's on the tenor or the flute. What an all-star lineup of young black men on the Savoy label, number 12017, putting it smack in 1955. And there's just a bit of a darker, more menacing sound to a lot of what the Black Cats were doing in the 50s. These were tough times. And what the White Cats on the West Coast were doing, they weren't hand-to-mouthing it quite the same way as a lot of these Black Cats were on the East Coast and in Chicago and throughout the Rust Belt, Detroit and Philadelphia, where a lot of the jazz musicians actually came from and migrated to Chicago, migrated to New York. There's just a wonderful feel to the 50s that, honestly, to me, it has a great freedom to it. It's loose. It's always got some blues. It's always swinging. It's never as calculated or as processed or as orchestrated. A lot of what starts to happen in the 60s is much more compositionally driven, and therefore there's more intellectual property at stake and more having to think about what you're doing as you move forward through the changes on the parts. And so, to me, that's one of the ironies of, as we go into what's supposed to be free, new thing, avant-garde, some of that stuff is fantastic, but it certainly feels, in some ways, less free less open to guys just blowing and expressing themselves. The canvas has more rules to it. Here the canvas is fairly open. We've decided we're going to paint this, a farm, okay, just for example. So as long as we keep it a farm and keep that melody and that sense of what's happening overall established, there's a lot of room to add color and sound and vibration and atmosphere and mood. That's kind of the whole essence of it. Pretty tough record to come by nowadays. This record can fetch a couple $100 pretty easily. Great album cover. As I told you, early Soundwaves are always black and white. If you have one that has a color photograph and it's under 12050, that's the second or third pressing of that record. Outstanding stuff, and something you should really try to find if you can. So we're going to move on now to the 60s, and this comes out in early 61. And Impulse was founded by Creed Taylor, who came over from Bethlehem to ABC Records. He works at ABC for a couple of years, convinces them to launch a jazz-only imprint called Impulse, with the great black and orange spines and pretty stylized covers and photographs with the gatefolds, and they are convinced to do it in part because he's got an agreement with Coltrane to come over from Atlantic, and Coltrane's had a great deal of success with My Favorite Things at Atlantic, kind of making them think we could get him to give us some hits, and Coltrane had other ideas, and they end up waiting to the 6th release of Impulse to put the first Coltrane out. The first 4 were much more commercially accessible records. This comes out number 6, Impulse number 6. Africa's on side 1, Greensleeves is on side 2 with Blue Miner. The lineup is pretty incredible. You have some Eric Dolphy on here. Where's the rest of the lineup? It's mostly the Coltrane Quartet. But you can hear already there's a dissonance, a pain, longing, a hunger, and of course Coltrane always has that seeking tone to his playing where he's trying to find that new bridge, that new tunnel, that new way to get to that next land, that next place. And he moves through his stages of his career so rapidly. Some guys spent years just developing and sounding a certain way. Coltrane, the second he gets comfortable, he moves on to the next thing. And listen to that dissonance. Listen to the brightness. And let's not be mistaken, there was some elements of this in the 50s. Pithecanthropus erectus by Charles Mingus definitely has volumes of some of this dissonance. Like I said, Jimmy Joffrey is again another great example of a guy that was pushing the envelope much earlier on as a white composer and arranger. But this music is far more composed. It's far more arranged in terms of we need to rehearse this piece so we know what we're doing. You need to know where the changes are, you need to know what the chords are, versus a lot of that 50s music that was very off the cuff. And a lot of times they're taking just kind of standards and songs everybody knows and just riffing. And this is much more of an orchestrated affair with, again, more of a cerebral intellectual approach at times. It's not to say it's not brilliant. And I was a huge Coltrane fan for the longest time. And I still am a huge Coltrane fan. And what I love about him more than anything else is the man's integrity, his sincerity. He might not always sound pleasant, but he sounds like he means it. And that can overcome for me a lot of the other obstacles. I can listen to Bob Dylan because I know where he's coming from. I can listen to Neil Young because he means it so much. And some of the most dissonant and uneasy Coltrane can be a challenging listen at times, but there's also kind of a spiritual cleansing necessity to it. It's not, we're not just doing this for fun, you know, it's not just, oh, this will be easy to do, this might be difficult to do, but it was essential and important to him. And I want to thank right now my friend David Yoshida, who sent me that box of Canadian goodies. He offered to purchase the new Coltrane live in Seattle of My Favorite Thing, Love Supreme. I'm curious to hear that. It's got other musicians on it, which I raise an eyebrow at that. It's going to really change the context of that song for me. But from my friend Ken McAuliffe and others have said, it seems like it's a noteworthy companion to the original piece. I look forward to be able to listen to that and give you guys some thoughts on that. But Africa Brass, it was when they handed it into Impulse, Creed Taylor was like, what? Seriously? Like, it made him uneasy. And he was not impressed with a lot of what Coltrane was moving into. This wasn't what he signed in his mind. And it's pretty clear when you read The House That Train Built and just read the interviews of the day. And even, like I said, Coltrane was their big signing coup, but it took them 6 releases to put this out. And they kind of almost like were like, let's slip this in there. And Creed Taylor wasn't long for Impulse, in part because this wasn't what he really wanted, to have to try to construct and shape this man's passions. And he knew, I think, that this was a wall that's load bearing and it's going to be tough to move it. I can try to steer Coltrane into alleys and avenues I want him to go into, but I think it's going to take me a lot of work. And when MGM bought Verve and they offered the position to him over there, he was quick to make that jump and bring his gatefolds and his great photography and sensationalized production to Verve and change the sound of Verve. And he does change the sound of jazz. You know, Creed Taylor does bring us Stan Getz and the Bossa Nova and all that wonderful, commercially accessible coffee table jazz. It's just, it's very loungy. It's not desperate. It's rarely hungry. But that Verve Creed Taylor stuff is of value, and it's meant to kind of entertain with and to be accessible. That leaves Bob Thiele here at Impulse with the Coltrane Reigns. And they do manage to get Coltrane to do ballads and to do with Ellington and to do with Johnny Hartman. But interspersed between that was Coltrane pushing the quartet further and further out into the realms of dissonance and chaos. And honestly, he's trying to make progress through the chaos. He's trying to say, unless we really shake some things loose, we'll probably never breathe right. We got to clean those lungs out. And so it's an exorcism, that whole process that Coltrane goes through in 63, 64, 65, and even the leap in what happens between My Favorite Things in 63 versus what he's doing in 65. And my friend Ken McAuliffe, who reviewed the record in his channel the other day, as he mentioned about Coltrane in 65, and I don't think he even recognizes just exactly how many records Coltrane does in 65. I did an episode about this last year. It's like 18, 19 records that are out, document what him and that group were doing in 65. And it's at the end of 65 where he starts bringing in Pharoah Sanders and some of the other players, Rashid Ali. Eventually, Alice, his wife, takes over from McCoy Tyner, and that group dissolves, and a new group comes together that's very pioneering, very on the edges of the avant-garde and challenging to the free. And when you get to albums like Ascension and Om and Kula Se Mama, these are records that are challenging to listen to, but do have a purifying intensity to them that will shake loose some of them cobwebs, and maybe we'll come up to the other side and be able to breathe a little bit easier. The Coltrane journey is a pretty spectacular one to follow, and it does take some patience and some ability to comprehend a man and his journey. And I think one of the things that Ken didn't touch on is I think part of what happens to Coltrane in 64, 65, 66 is he started to recognize his own mortality. His health issues are creeping in. They're not well documented, but he knows the liver problems and his health is waning. And I think it's kind of accelerating his process of discovery. He's pushing through to new lands, trying to discover purpose and meaning. If there's an altar I need to bow at before I pass away, let me find it. If there's a kingdom that I need to ascend to in my dying, let me, through my music, my prayer, my intercession, have it be revealed to me. And I feel like that's a lot of what his music and art is saying. And 64, 65, 66 is, if there's a heaven, show it to me. Reveal yourself to me. And he was never limited to one theology. He wasn't just seeking through the Christian lens or the Muslim lens or the Buddhist lens. He was kind of taking all those doctrines, all those philosophies, and kind of singularly reducing them down to a human spirituality, and now saying, okay, cosmos, creator, where do I fit? And what is my purpose? And what do you want from me? Because I want the keys to the kingdom. I've given my life to this music, to this art, and there's never been a moment of pretension. It's always been the most sincere quest. And I feel like as his mortality becomes an issue, that seeking, that desperation becomes even more prominent in his sound. And then by late 66, I feel like his weakness as he's deteriorating starts to be really obvious in some of those recordings. He's definitely losing some of his strength and some of his resolve and some of his steam. And by 67, he wasn't long for this world, and we lost one of the great spiritual leaders of the 20th century. That's how I feel about John Coltrane. And these records that are on Impulse document a spiritual quest. And as much as I love Blue Train on Blue Note, and as much as I love his Prestige work, and even his Atlantic work, Giant Steps, and My Favorite Things, and those records are precursors to getting him to a door. It gets him through the woods and through the mountains and over the rivers, and it gets him to this doorway. And when he walks through that doorway at Impulse, where he was kind of given a blank slate, saying, here you go, here's a blank sheet of paper, make us some hits. In his mind, he said, let me dig deep, let me find a path. And the freedom that he was guaranteed when he signed with Impulse, it ends up becoming a noose around Creed Taylor's neck. And even Bob Thiele was hard pressed to work with the man. But there's no question that Thiele had his hands full and was probably a more lenient A&R producer than Creed Taylor was. I think Creed Taylor's vision was always so singular that when you crossed him, he just kind of moved on to the next thing. And you see that throughout his career as he just keeps moving along. He wants to further and further whittle down what's happening to be what he's looking to make. And Bethlehem was a start, ABC was a start, Impulse was a start, Verve was getting closer to what he wanted. Then eventually the A&M CTI stuff, that's the Creed Taylor universe, I think, codified. That's what he was looking to do. And he starts doing that with, Shades of Jade, Cal Jader, that Verve stuff in the mid-60s. But really, I think in the 70s, some of that stuff he makes with Hubert Laws, I think Creed Taylor was euphoric listening to that stuff. It's pretty light, some of it. Another record that really captures the 60s is this fantastic Grasham Mancour record. This is on Blue Note, number 4153, puts about 1963. So a few years after what we just heard, same year as Love Supreme. The lineup here is a big part of what's going on. When you have Bobby Hutcherson, Lee Morgan, Jackie McLean, Bob Crenshaw, Tony Williams, along with Grasham Mancour. Grasham Mancour is kind of a real enigma. He's a trombone player, but you don't really think of him in that sense as much as you think of him as a composer, an arranger, a brilliant soundscape engineer. That's kind of where I feel he fits in and how other musicians saw him. I don't think Katz worked with Grasham to be enveloped by his playing. And he's a great player, but it's always the composition, the overall sound of what's happening that I feel like great little tempo change there. And again, this is something that doesn't have necessarily the same openness and looseness of that 50s sound. Once it starts to become more composed, it has more signposts saying, okay, and go, pause, slow down. All these sign markers in some ways are limiting the free aspect of it, but they're also creating tonescapes and sound moods that the 50s never really touched on in some ways. But like I said, Pithecanthropus in '56 was light years ahead of its time. Again, this is a record where the sum of its parts is the point. And there's a lot of records from the hard bop era where it's the individual players that were kind of like, oh, Morgan's on this, Coltrane, Moby's on this. This here, it really is about the unified congealing of the composition. Hutcherson's not trying to kill you here with a lot of things. He's giving you a feel. And the whole record is a marvelous testament to a brilliant composer in mind. This record, the first song was called Air Raid. The track Evolution here, you can just really feel a film type soundscape. And the players, like I said, seem to be almost in an Om meditative state, just delving into Grashon's composition. And I'm pretty sure he composes all the stuff on this. Indeed he does. And so, like I said, Moncur was a real ahead of his time assembly of talent guy to help realize what he wants to hear. And it's fantastic. There's such an edge. If you listen to the vibes, it's Hitchcock-like. There's a tension, a dissonance, an element of discord that creates an uneasiness. And guys like Jackie McLean and Lee Morgan are only thrilled to add apparitions and spirits upon this atmospheric landscape. It's pretty interesting stuff. But this is the 60s as the 60s jazz gets. And it's quite different from the freedom and the looseness of what the 50s were about and the blues-based simplicity of that era. And again, there's such a dichotomy here where the average fan thinks jazz is always complicated and bebop pushes that agenda. Hard bop kind of brings it back to the people, and then the avant-garde movement, the free movement, again pushes us into the place where it becomes about musicianship and about being able to read charts. It's a much more complex musician-driven thing that I think non-musicians don't value the same way. The musician in me loves a lot of this stuff. The DJ in me says, I can't really use that very often. If I'm DJing a haunted house and kids are walking in and I want them to step on some broken glass and have some eggs crumble under their feet, like, it's got that kind of a soundscape to it, but it's super melancholic and it's super visual. So it's a very interesting place and time in the history of jazz in the mid-60s. And Blue Note was always kind of hesitant to go down this road. And I think it tells you something about Grashon Moncur. That Alfred was like, you know, you're not exactly doing what I feel or like, but this is pretty cool stuff. And Grashon really steps into it on these records. Next, I want to show you a couple things that I feel really encapsulate the 70s sound. One of the real challenges I feel black musicians face is, how do I move my career forward financially, exposure-wise, and develop myself as a musician and as a man who can make a living doing this without alienating or driving away my black audience. It's a very tough line that a lot of these guys have to walk and balance. And there's no secret that in order to really make a good living in music, you kind of need to embrace a white audience and get a big label to push and promote your music. And it's very tough, I think, for a lot of these guys to try to toe that line. And I think a lot of us as white jazz fans are so willing to take the rock, fusion, jazz, R&B sounds of the 70s and just digest them and feel very comfortable in those shoes. But I feel like for a lot of the black community, they had left jazz a while back and they were following that organ soul jazz sound in the 60s. And as the 70s comes along, a lot of the great funk bands of the 70s have their roots in R&B crossover jazz sounds from the late 60s. Earth, Wind and Fire, Kool and the Gang, the Ohio Players. These guys started off playing jazz. And a lot of it was the jazz that was soulful and had R&B edges to it. And as we move into the 70s, Miles Davis, of course, makes Bitches Brew. Weather Report comes around. The One DC Orchestra comes out with Herbie Hancock and that crew. But I feel when Herbie moves on to his Columbia label and he embraces commercial viability with these records, he makes some records that to me are fantastic. Great playing, great pocket, great sound production, but they also encapsulate the sound of the 70s. We're bringing in sounds of disco, R&B, infusing it all and making a very commercially welcoming sound. Manchild's a classic. It's a record I've had for 25 years. Herbie Hancock's early work in the 70s on Warner Brothers is much more challenging. It's much less pocket-driven, commercially accessible, and it's got different angles to it. And it was this music, I think, that brought the black audience back to these artists, these trad jazz guys. The avant-garde never really appealed to the black audience very much. And I know that from DJing, trying to play certain things, Grover Washington is what they wanted to hear. Donald Byrd from the 70s is what they wanted to hear, not Thelonious Monk, not Miles Davis, not Bitches Brew. That was as far away from what they wanted as possible. So Manchild, I feel, is just a great example of that 70s fusion and what was happening around jazz in this era. George Benson's another great proponent of the sound. I'm a big fan of what these guys are doing at this point. And then this is the Headhunters, and these Headhunters guys were often the guys playing with Herbie at this point, and they got a few records of their own here. And I want to play a little bit of this because it's just funky. And God Made Me Funky is what this is called. It's fantastic. That group that Herbie surrounds himself with, it's just some incredibly talented guys. Paul Jackson on the bass, Benny Maupin doing some of the horns, Mike Clark is on the drums, Bill Summers also does percussion and drums, and he makes some great funk crossover records, R&B records. Blackbird McKnight on the guitar. These cats can play, and they lay down pocket. It's really fun, accessible, a great listen, and this is kind of textbook 70s jazz for me. And every one of these decades has edges that the music pushes, boundaries. But if you had to define the 50s, that Buddy Collette record would be a great way to do so. That Cannonball Adderley, Kenny Clark record would be a great way to hear what the 50s sounds like. The 60s, again, that Grasham Mancour, that Africa Brass, gives you some of the innovations that happened in the 60s. And then in the 70s, it's the fusion with funk and R&B and how soul jazz kind of grows into these sounds that, to me, I think encapsulates the sound of 70s jazz. And while there is a lot of stuff like Weather Report and One Dicey Group and some of the Miles stuff that's less accessible, and some people hold that stuff in much higher esteem, in part because it is less accessible, there's a lot of stuff like this that's just fun to listen to. So, again, and once you get to the 80s, I think it's really hard to define a jazz sound at that point. It's become such a peripheral thing. There's a whole movement of easy listening elevator jazz that's, to me, quite nauseating. Jazz, it makes me think of dragons and mystical things, supernatural. That stuff's all very disconnected from the jazz to me at the root of it. And of course, you can define the 40s with bebop, the 30s with swing, and the 20s with Dixie. So every decade kind of does have a sound. And these sounds all blend and blur, and sometimes get reborn and have revivals. That's part of the whole thing. But I just thought it'd be interesting to hear 50s, 60s, and 70s kind of codified, so that someone who doesn't know jazz as well, maybe this will help you recognize, oh, that's 60s jazz. And you get to a certain point where you can hear a song in a film or on Pandora or Spotify, and you can tell pretty quickly, okay, that's 60s jazz, that's 50s jazz, that's 40s jazz. And 40s jazz, sometimes it's easier to hear because the recording sounds aren't as elaborate or as well produced as they get to be in the 50s, 60s, and 70s. And I think it's part of what happens to jazz in the 80s is the multi-tracking in these big studios kind of throttle innovation and inspiration and kind of have us tracking things at different times, and the dialogue that's supposed to exist in jazz is silenced. So that's it for today. Hope you enjoyed that. Again, if you want to support the channel and help me through this difficult time, it'd be appreciated. Go to my Patreon page, buy a hoodie or a t-shirt or a coffee mug in the merchandise store. There's a new podcast up for my last episode that is there if you want to walk around and listen to it. I know it's only for a select few, but it's still there if you're interested. Y'all be safe. Have a great day. Enjoy your jazz, guys. Peace.